The freight wagon lurched over another rut, and Clara Beatrice Vogt felt the impact travel up her spine like a slow shiver of dread. For 3 days, she had ridden in the back of this miserable conveyance, wedged between crates that smelled of turpentine and dust, her trunk serving as both seat and pillow. Outside the canvas flaps, the Arizona Territory stretched in every direction, a vast, bone-white emptiness that shimmered under the August sun as though the earth itself were fevered. She was 22 years old, born in a village outside Hamburg where the river Elbe turned silver in the mornings. Raised in the suffocating tenements of New York where the air tasted of coal smoke and desperation. She had crossed an ocean and a continent with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter in her pocket, a letter that promised marriage to a widower farmer near the mining town of Coyote Springs. A man who needed a wife and would accept an immigrant girl with calloused hands and stubborn hope. She had saved for 2 years. Every penny earned stitching shirts in a garment factory, every coin scraped together mending linens for a boarding house. She had counted each one twice, stored them in a tin box under her narrow bed, dreamed of a home with a garden and children, and a life that did not taste of lint and exhaustion. But 3 days ago, while the guard dozed in the sun and the driver cursed his mules in a language she did not fully understand, Clara had noticed something that made her blood turn cold as winter rain. The crates stacked around her were marked with women's names. Not goods, not supplies. Women's names. Remedios, Guinevere, Valentina. Beside each name, a size waist-bust height and a price chalked in neat, businesslike script, as though the women were livestock bound for auction. She had waited until the guard's snores grew steady, then pried open the nearest crate with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger bound in cracked leather. Its pages were filled with columns, names, ages, physical descriptions, destinations. At the bottom of each entry, a sum of money. At the top of each page, a single name inked in bold strokes, Horatio Finch, proprietor. Clara was not naive. She had worked in the garment district long enough to know what happened to girls who disappeared from the tenements. Girls who followed advertisements promising respectable work only to end up in places where screams went unanswered and doors locked from the outside. This was not a marriage bureau. This was a bill of sale. She had slipped the ledger beneath the lining of her corset, the leather cool and damning against her ribs, and tried to breathe normally. But her hands would not stop shaking. Her throat felt tight, as though an invisible noose were already closing. Now the guard riding shotgun, a raw-boned man with tobacco juice staining his beard and a Colt revolver riding heavy on his hip, kept glancing back at her through the gap in the canvas. His eyes were flat, unreadable, the way a butcher might look at a calf before slaughter. Clara folded her hands in her lap to still their trembling and tried to meet his gaze without flinching. But her heart hammered against the hidden ledger, and she wondered if he could hear it. The wagon rattled on. The sun climbed higher, merciless and white. The landscape offered no comfort, only scrub and stone, and the skeletal remains of yucca plants, their dry stalks pointing at the sky like accusatory fingers. The heat pressed down like a hand on her chest, making it hard to draw breath. Sweat trickled down her spine, soaking the fabric of her dress. The guard's hand drifted toward his revolver. Then from somewhere in the scrubland to the north came the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The sound split the air like breaking glass. The driver shouted and lashed the mules, and Clara felt the wagon lurch violently to the left. The guard twisted in his seat, scanning the ridgeline with narrowed eyes, raising his own rifle. She saw them before he did, 3 riders, silhouetted against the pale sky, coming fast down the slope in a cloud of dust that rose like smoke. Apache. She had never seen one before, but she knew. They wore no feathers, no war paint, just plain buckskin shirts dark with sweat and trousers tucked into high moccasins. But they moved with a fluidity that spoke of lives lived beyond fences and laws. More shots. The mules screamed a high, terrible sound. and veered sharply left toward a shallow washout where the trail narrowed to little more than a scratch in the earth. The driver hauled on the reins, swearing, trying to force the panicked animals back, but they were beyond reason. The wagon tilted dangerously. Clara felt herself sliding toward the open back, her skirts tangling around her boots, her hands scrabbling desperately for purchase on the splintered boards that tore at her palms. Her fingers closed on nothing but air. She tumbled halfway out legs, dragging inches from the spinning rear wheel, that iron-rimmed wheel that would crush bone and flesh without pause if she fell beneath it. The ground blurred below her stones, dust thorns the earth rushing past fast enough to kill. Her breath caught in her throat, the scream building but unable to escape. Then a hand closed around her wrist. The grip was iron-strong, unyielding. She looked up and saw him, a tall man on a bay horse, long black hair streaming behind him like a banner. A narrow bonnet of eagle feathers bound to his head with leather cord. His face was all sharp angles and sun-browned skin, his eyes dark as creek stones and just as unreadable. He leaned low in the saddle, every muscle in his arm straining as he hauled her up and onto the horse behind him in one brutal, efficient motion. Her skirts caught, tore with a sound like ripping canvas, and then she was pressed against his back, arms locked around his ribs in a grip born of pure terror. The horse wheeling beneath them as the wagon overturned with a splintering crash that echoed across the empty land. The guard fired wildly, his shots going wide in panic. One bullet sang past Clara's ear close enough that she felt the heat of its passage. Another struck rock and ricocheted into the scrub with a high whining sound. The man the Apache kicked his horse into a full gallop, angling toward a distant line of cottonwoods that marked the presence of water. Clara felt a sudden jerk, his body flinching beneath her arms, and saw blood darkening the buckskin shirt at his shoulder. He did not slow. He did not make a sound. He only rode harder. They reached the trees and plunged into blessed shade. The horse splashed through a shallow river water, spraying up in silver arcs, then scrambled up the far bank and stopped at last, sides heaving like a bellows. The man swung down in one smooth motion and reached up to grab Clara by both arms, pulling her from the saddle so sharply that she had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Listen," he said in careful accented English, his breath coming hard. "Those men back there, they do not bring you to a husband. They sell you, like a horse, like a gun. Do you understand?" Clara stared at him, mouth open, but no sound emerging. This stranger, this Apache warrior, who had just pulled her from certain death, knew the truth she had only discovered 3 days ago, and had been too terrified to speak aloud. Hoofbeats thudded on the ridge above them, drawing closer. The man glanced up, his jaw tightening, and then looked back at her. His grip on her arms was firm, but not cruel. "They're kind," he said, meaning the guards and the traffickers behind them. "They only leave alone what another man already owns. So if you want to live, you walk with me as though you belong to me." Clara blinked, trying to make sense of his words through the fog of shock. "As though what do you mean?" "Pretend you are my woman. Apache woman. My law, not theirs." His gaze was flat with urgency, stripped of softness or charm. Among outlaws, they back away from another man's claim. In the towns, the sheriff must think twice before he acts. They will hang an Apache for touching a white woman, but they must listen if she says she chose him. That buys us time to gather proof against the man who owns you. It was an ugly calculus, brutal in its clarity. But the burning wagon behind them, the shouts of men on the ridge, the ledger still pressed against her ribs, all of it proved he was right. The man shouldered his rifle despite the blood spreading slowly down his sleeve, and led her deeper into the cottonwoods, where the shadows pooled like water. His name, she would learn in the hours to come, was Nantan. Long Shadow, the whites called him, though they spoke it with a curl of the lip that suggested neither respect nor kindness. And his one condition was simple, carved from years of betrayal, sharp enough to draw blood help when paid then right away. No more entanglements with white law. No white woman's troubles dragging at his heels like chains. Calling her his woman was supposed to be just another tool, no different from a knife or a rifle, something to be used, and then set aside. But some tools, once taken up, change the hand that holds them. They followed the crooked river south for 2 full days, keeping to the willows and the deep shadow of the low bluffs where the sun could not reach. The heat was a living thing, oppressive and malicious. It hammered the land into submission, baking the mud into patterns of cracks that looked like broken pottery, turning the air into something thick and hard to breathe. Clara's straw hat offered little protection. By noon each day her face was flushed the color of brick and her lips cracked and bled. Despite the water Nantan rationed with a careful hand. He moved through the heat as though it were no more than a minor annoyance, his steps steady, and sure his eyes always scanning the ridges and the high places where a man with a rifle might hide. He did not speak much at first. And when he did, his words were stripped of ornamentation, plain and direct as a knife blade. But Clara learned his story in fragments pieced together from those brief, quiet exchanges. He had scouted for the army once years ago, guiding blue-coated officers through Apache country in exchange for food rations for his band on the reservation. The promises had been written on paper, signed and sealed, but they had broken like cheap glass under the weight of greed and indifference. Government agents sold the good beef meant for the Apache and delivered spoiled meat, instead pocketing the difference. Children went hungry. Old ones died in the cold. It was during one of those lean winters, a winter so hard the snow turned gray with ash from desperate fires, that the relocation raid came. Soldiers and civilian contractors descended on the reservation in the dark hours before dawn, rounding up families, hauling them onto wagons bound for places no one named. They called it relocation. The Apache called it theft. Nantan had been away tracking deer in the high country, trying to bring back meat for the starving. When he returned 2 days later, his sister was gone. Ryan. She had been 15 years old, quick-witted and stubborn as spring frost, with a laugh that could brighten even the darkest day. The elders told him the wagons had left in the night, heading south toward the border, but no one could say where they had gone after that. The soldiers claimed ignorance. The contractors had vanished like smoke. He mentioned it only once on the second evening as they sat by a small fire in a sheltered hollow where the smoke would not be seen. His voice was flat, drained of emotion, as though he had told the story so many times it had worn smooth. "The wagons that took her," he said, staring into the flames. "They were not army. Civilian freight. I tracked them to the border, but the trail went cold near a ranch in Sonora. Later, I learned those contractors sometimes worked for merchants who..." He stopped, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords. "Who sold what they were paid to relocate?" Clara listened without interrupting, her chest tight. She did not yet understand the full weight of what he was saying, but she filed the detail away, civilian freight wagons' disappearances near the border. It was a small piece of a larger horror, and she had a terrible feeling it would fit into the ledger she carried like a key, turning in a lock. After that, Nantan had left the reservation. He refused to sign the new papers the agents brought, refused to bow his head and accept their lies. He sold his tracking skills to anyone who would pay railroad men laying track through hostile country ranchers, hunting rustlers, sometimes even marshals tracking fugitives, but he took no permanent ties. No family. No tribe. No entanglements with white people beyond the cold exchange of money for service. He had reduced himself to a single, unbreakable rule help, when paid then right away. Clara told her own story in return, speaking carefully, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She had answered an advertisement placed by a man named Horatio Finch, who claimed to represent a widower farmer near Coyote Springs. The letter had been kind, almost gentle, promising a modest home with a garden, children, if she wished a life of simple dignity, far from the grime and noise of the city. She had believed it because she had needed to believe it. She had saved for 2 years, crossing the ocean in steerage and then the continent in third-class rail cars, clutching that letter like a talisman against fear. But now she understood the truth. She had not been traveling toward a husband. She had been traveling toward a buyer. Finch does not let his property go easily, Nantan said one evening as they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames casting long shadows across his face. In the mining camps, there are 10 white men for every white woman. A girl with papers signed by a marriage broker is worth more than a herd of horses. He will hunt you with everything he has. Clara nodded slowly, her throat tight. She understood. The danger was not some distant, abstract threat. It was immediate and specific. Ahead of them lay miners desperate for wives, bounty hunters, eager for Apache scalps, and territorial laws that treated their very proximity as a crime worthy of hanging. The pretense Nantan proposed that she was his woman traveling with him by her own free will was both shield and noose, protecting her from some dangers while exposing them both to others. On the 3rd day, they crossed into rougher country. The river narrowed, cutting through red stone canyons, where the heat was trapped and magnified, until it felt like being inside an oven. Clara's mare stumbled on the loose shale, sending pebbles skittering down the slope, and Nantan had to dismount and lead both horses by hand, picking his way through the rubble with the patience of a man who had done this 100 times before and knew the cost of haste. They camped that night beneath an overhanging ledge, the sky above them deepening from blue to indigo to black, the stars appearing one by one until they were thick as spilled salt. Clara sat with her back against the rock, the ledger open in her lap, copying names into a small notebook she had salvaged from her trunk. She worked by firelight, her handwriting careful and deliberate, trying to preserve every detail. If they were going to expose Horatio Finch, they would need evidence that could not be easily destroyed or dismissed. Nantan watched her work for a long time, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Finally, he said, "Why do you care so much? You are free now. You could ride east, find work in another city, start again." Clara looked up, meeting his gaze across the fire. The flames danced between them, casting shadows that made his face look older, harder. "Because I am not the only one he has done this to," she said quietly. "And if I run without speaking, he will do it again to someone else. Maybe someone younger than me. Maybe someone who does not speak English, who does not know how to fight back." She paused, then added, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "I worked in a garment factory for 4 years. I saw girls disappear. Everyone knew where they went, but no one spoke up, because speaking up meant losing your job, maybe worse. I will not be silent again. Not about this." Something shifted in his face, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or respect. He turned back to the fire and said nothing more, but she thought she saw the faintest nod of acknowledgement, as though she had passed some test she had not known she was taking. The next morning, they found tracks along the riverbank, 2 horses shod, moving fast. Nantan knelt and studied the prints, running his fingers along the edge of one hoof print, as though reading a language written in dirt. When he straightened, his jaw was tight. "Finch's men," he said. "They know we came this way. We need to reach town before they catch us in open country." They pushed on, but the sense of pursuit was constant now, a weight pressing down on Clara's shoulders that made every sound seem louder, every shadow darker. She found herself glancing back over her shoulder, her breath coming a little too fast, her hands gripping the reins a little too tightly. Nantan noticed, but he said nothing. He only moved his horse closer to hers, a silent reassurance. By late afternoon on the fourth day, they reached the outskirts of Coyote Springs. The sun hung low and red on the horizon, painting the dust on the trail the color of old blood. The town was a strip of weather-gray buildings clinging to the main street like barnacles on a ship's hull saloon, assay office, telegraph shack livery, and a few false front stores that pretended to be grander than they were. A fiddler sawed out a tune in the open yard behind the saloon, and men in sweat-stained shirts stomped the dust in rough approximation of a dance. A handful of women stood together near the tables, watching with guarded eyes. The air smelled of wood smoke, horse manure, whiskey, and something else, something harder to name but unmistakable in a place like this. Desperation, perhaps, or greed. Nantan cleaned his buckskin shirt as best he could, brushing off the worst of the dust, and straightened the eagle feather bonnet he wore. It was a trophy from his time scouting with Plains warriors, he had told her, though he did not elaborate beyond that. Clara wore her plainest dress, the hem still torn from the wagon, and pulled her straw hat low over her face to hide the bruises forming along her cheekbone. Nantan kept his hand light but steady on her elbow as they walked into town together. A physical claim, deliberate and unmistakable, meant as much for her safety as for the performance he knew they must give. Their goal was clear, though dangerous. Horatio Finch operated from an office above the saloon, and he kept his main ledger there, the master record with all the names, all the contracts, all the payments that tied him to a trafficking ring, stretching from Coyote Springs to Tucson and beyond. Clara knew some of what was in those pages. Together they could expose him. But they had to retrieve the book before Horatio realized his freight wagon had never arrived. As they walked into the yard together, every eye turned to watch. The music faltered for a moment, then resumed, but the notes sounded forced, unnatural. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Clara felt the weight of those stares like hands on her skin, pressing, judging, stripping her bare. Horatio Finch stood near a table stacked with bottles of whiskey, laughing at something a mine owner had said. He was a lean man in his 40s, dressed in a fine wool suit that must have cost more than Clara earned in a year, his beard trimmed to a sharp point, his smile easy and practiced. She recognized him instantly. She had seen him at the rail depot where she had been processed 3 weeks ago, her measurements taken, her hair and teeth examined, as though she were a horse at auction. His gaze swept across the yard, passed over her, then snapped back. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something colder, calculation. His eyes moved from her to Nantan, taking in the torn dress, the dust, the way Nantan's hand rested on her elbow. His smile did not falter, but it changed, becoming something harder, sharper. 2 of Horatio's hired men started toward them through the crowd. The taller one, raw-boned and half-drunk, his face flushed from whiskey, reached for Clara's wrist. His fingers closed around her arm, grip bruising. "You lost, miss," he said, his voice thick and slurred. "That Indian bothering you, we can take care of him right quick, real quick." The question was a trap, and Clara understood it with a clarity that cut through her fear like cold water. If she said yes, they would drag Nantan out back and shoot him for her honor, and she would be delivered to Horatio as damaged goods, her value diminished but not destroyed. If she hesitated, if she showed even a moment's uncertainty, the crowd would decide she was sullied beyond redemption, and Nantan would be marked for hanging while she was sold off cheap to whoever would take her. Nantan moved before she could speak. He stepped behind her, both arms folding around her shoulders, his chest a solid wall at her back. The heat of him was startling after days of careful distance, the scent of dust and leather and sweat and something else, something indefinably him. He bowed his head and pressed a deliberate claiming kiss to the side of her straw hat, his lips brushing the sun-warmed hair at her temple with unmistakable intent, lingering just long enough to make the gesture read as intimate, possessive real. Clara's eyes went wide. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, involuntary gasp that she could not suppress. The shock of the touch unexpected, calculated, and yet somehow not entirely unwelcome, sent heat flooding through her that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. Around them, the yard fell utterly silent. The fiddle's bow lifted from the string's mid-note. 4 men stood frozen mid-step, bottles gleaming on the table dust, hanging suspended in the golden evening light like particles of gold. It was a tableau perfect and terrible, burned into Clara's memory with the clarity of a photograph. "She is my woman." Nantan set his voice even and pitched to carry across the yard without shouting. "She came with me from the reservation. We traveled together by her choice, not yours. You lay a hand on her, my people will come for yours. You understand blood for blood. That is Apache law." It was not a plea. It was a threat wrapped in cultural friction and delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. The raw-boned cowboy froze his hand, still gripping Clara's wrist, but no longer pulling. Others in the yard bristled, muttering about savages and trouble, but no one moved. The stories of Apache raids were still fresh enough, women and children taken settlements, burned, men found days later, tied to wagon wheels, and left for the sun that even drunk men paused before lighting that particular fire. The sheriff, a stocky man named Horatio Harlan. No relation to Finch, though their shared first name was an irony Clara did not miss, stepped between them with the weary air of a man who had broken up too many fights and buried too many bodies. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, but he did not draw. "This town has had enough bloodshed for 1 year." He said, his voice rough as gravel. "If the lady says she's where she wants to be, that's the end of it. For now." Clara felt Nantan's breath against her ear, warm and steady. She swallowed hard, forced her voice to work. "I am with him by my own choosing," she said, and was surprised by how steady she sounded. "No one is forcing me to be here." The legal truth was tangled and treacherous. A white woman could not legally marry an Apache under territorial law, and everyone in the yard knew it. But her public statement bought them exactly what they needed, one uneasy night in town, before the fragile peace shattered. Horatio Finch watched from across the yard, his smile gone, his eyes sharp and cold as broken glass. He did not move, did not speak, but Clara saw the exact moment, understanding settled over him like a shroud. The wagon was overdue. The girl was here with an Apache. The ledger might be missing. His hand drifted toward the pocket where he kept his watch, checking the time, as though already calculating his next move. Then he turned on his heel and walked quickly toward the saloon, his shoulders stiff with barely controlled fury. Nantan's arms loosened, but he did not step away immediately. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "We do not have much time. He knows something is wrong. We get the ledger tonight, or we lose our chance forever." Clara nodded, her heart still hammering against her ribs. "Tonight?" she whispered back. Midnight found Coyote Springs quiet, except for the sound of drunken snoring drifting from open windows, the occasional bark of a dog, and the slow creak of the saloon sign swinging in the night breeze. Nantan and Clara moved through the shadows, like wraiths keeping to the narrow alley behind the saloon, where the moonlight could not reach and the darkness pooled thick as oil. Ruth Miller, the town school teacher, stood watch near the schoolhouse, with a lantern pretending to finish locking up for the night. She was a thin woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, her dress plain calico worn thin at the elbows, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that added years to her face. She had listened to Clara's story earlier that evening, with the keen attention of someone who had heard whispers before, but had chosen until now to remain silent. "I have seen too many girls arrive in this town, bruised and silent." Ruth had said, her voice low and fierce. "I have taught them to read and write, and then watch them disappear into houses where the doors lock from the outside. If you can bring proof against Finch, real proof, not just stories, I will risk what I must to help you." Now she stood sentinel, one hand on the schoolhouse doorframe, ready to slam it and ring the bell if trouble came down the street. The outside staircase to Horatio's office creaked under their combined weight, despite their care. Nantan tested each step before putting his full weight on it, moving with the silent precision of a hunter stalking prey through autumn leaves. Clara followed, her skirts gathered in one hand to keep them from dragging, the other hand pressed against the rough wooden rail. Her breath came shallow and quick, her heart beating so hard she was certain it could be heard. The door at the top was secured with a heavy iron padlock, but the window beside it was not latched. Nantan worked the blade of his knife under the sash, levering it up with slow, agonizing care to avoid any sudden sound. The window slid open with a faint whisper of wood on wood. He climbed through first, then reached back to help Clara. His hand was warm and steady around hers, grounding her. Inside the office was cramped and suffocating, the air thick with the smell of old paper cigar smoke, lamp oil, and something else, something sour and unpleasant that spoke of secrets kept and cruelties enacted. A single lamp burned low on the desk, casting long shadows across maps of the territory. Account books stacked in neat piles, and a framed photograph of Horatio shaking hands with a territorial official. Clara's hands trembled as she moved to the desk. She had seen Horatio open a hidden compartment once back at the rail depot when she was being processed. He had thought no one was watching, but Clara had learned long ago to be invisible, to observe without being seen. She remembered the motion, his hand reaching under the desk lip, his fingers searching for something pressing. She felt along the underside of the desk now, her fingers tracing the wood grain, searching for anything that felt out of place. There, a small brass lever recessed into the wood, cool beneath her fingertips. She pressed it, and a shallow drawer sprang open with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Inside were carefully bound pages, contracts written in precise legal language letters bearing official seals, and another ledger larger and more detailed than the one she had stolen from the wagon. She slid them out with shaking hands and tucked them beneath her shawl, pressing them against her ribs beside the first ledger. The weight of them felt both reassuring and terrifying. That was when the bootsteps sounded on the staircase outside, heavy, deliberate, the tread of a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he would find when he arrived. Nantan spun toward the door, his knife appearing in his hand, as though conjured. Clara froze, clutching the ledgers against her chest, her breath stopping in her throat. The door burst open with a splintering crash, and a man stood silhouetted in the frame, narrow-faced, with a nose that had been broken and healed, crooked, two revolvers in his hands, eyes glittering with hate and anticipation. Bitter Sam, Hollis. A bounty hunter with a long memory and a ledger of his own, one written in blood and grudges. Nantan had broken that nose in a bar fight 2 years ago over an Apache woman Sam had been dragging back to a reservation in chains. The woman had been innocent of any crime, guilty only of leaving land the government had assigned her. Nantan had intervened. Sam had not forgotten. He fired without warning, without words. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Nantan's head, sending shards of wood flying like shrapnel. Nantan shoved Clara down hard behind the desk, then lunged forward, knife flashing in the lamplight. Sam's second shot went wide, punching through the window and shattering the glass into the night with a sound like breaking ice. The two men collided in the doorway, grappling for control of the revolvers, their breath coming in harsh gasps, their bodies locked in a brutal dance. Clara scrambled to her feet, adrenaline overriding the paralysis of fear. She grabbed the lamp from the desk, a heavy brass thing with a glass chimney, and hurled it with all her strength at Sam's legs. The glass shattered on impact oil, splashing across the floorboards in dark spreading pools, and flames leapt up with a sudden, hungry roar that filled the room with orange light and choking smoke. Sam cursed a stream of profanity that would have made a miner blush and staggered back, beating at his trousers where the burning oil had splashed. Nantan used the distraction to kick him hard in the chest with the flat of his boot, sending him sprawling backward onto the narrow balcony. Then Nantan grabbed Clara's hand, his grip iron-strong and unyielding, and pulled her toward the shattered window. Behind them, flames raced across the floor with terrifying speed, igniting the papers on the desk, climbing the walls, filling the room with heat and smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. Nantan kicked a loose plank free from the balcony rail and shoved it across to the sloped tin roof of the building next door. It formed a narrow, precarious bridge, barely wide enough for one person, and the drop to the alley below was 20 feet onto hard-packed dirt studded with broken bottles and rusted nails. He went first, testing the plank with his weight, moving quickly, but carefully, his balance perfect. Then he reached back for Clara. "Do not look down," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos, despite the fire roaring behind them and the shouting rising from the street below. "Look only at me. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak, and stepped onto the plank. It bowed under her weight, creaking ominously. Her legs shook. The heat of the fire was at her back, pushing her forward, smoke billowing out the window and making her eyes water and her lungs burn. The drop yawned beneath her like an open grave, and she could see every detail of the alley below. Broken crates, a dead rat, a rusted horseshoe, half buried in the dirt. "Step. That is right. Good. Again." His voice was an anchor. She focused on his eyes, dark and steady in the firelight, and inched forward, one foot in front of the other, her skirts tangling and threatening to trip her. The plank bowed further. When she was halfway across, it cracked, not breaking, but the sound of wood beginning to fail, and her breath caught in a sob of terror. But Nantan was there, his hand reaching out, closing around her wrist. "I have you," he said. "Keep moving." She took another step, then another, and then she was across and he was pulling her onto the tin roof. They slid down together, the metal hot beneath their hands, even through the fabric of their clothes, and dropped into the alley, landing hard. Clara's ankle twisted pain, shooting up her leg like lightning. But she bit back the cry and forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, flames roared from the office window, tongues of fire licking at the night sky like the devil's own breath. Bitter Sam stood on the balcony, silhouetted against the inferno, his face twisted with rage and frustration. "I will take your scalp, you filthy savage," he shouted after them, his voice hoarse. "And I will drag that white girl back to Finch in chains. You hear me? There is nowhere you can hide." They ran. For the next 7 days, they lived as fugitives, and the land tested them with a cruelty that felt almost personal. The Arizona territory unfolded before them in shades of brown and red and gold, vast, indifferent, beautiful, in the way that dangerous things can be beautiful. They crossed grasslands dotted with cholla cactus and yucca, the thorns sharp enough to pierce boot leather. They dropped into canyons where clear creeks cut through stands of cottonwood that offered brief, blessed shade and the illusion of safety. Nantan moved through the terrain with practiced ease, reading signs in the land that Clara was only beginning to understand, at the angle of a broken twig that spoke of a rider's passage, the pattern of stones that indicated a hidden spring, and the behavior of birds that warned of danger ahead. He showed her which plants held water in their roots, how to move quietly over loose stone, where to look for game trails, and how to avoid leaving tracks that could be followed. He taught her these things not with long explanations, but with brief demonstrations and patience. And Clara absorbed them the way parched ground absorbs rain, desperately, gratefully. On the 4th day, after fleeing Coyote Springs, they came to a river crossing where the water ran high and fast from a storm that had passed through the mountains days before, dumping rain on slopes too dry to absorb it. The current was strong enough to move stones, cold enough to steal breath, and the bottom was slick with moss that made every step treacherous. Nantan's bay horse stepped carefully into the flow, testing each footfall. But Clara's mare balked at the water's edge, eyes rolling white ears, pinned back flat against her skull in pure terror. "Easy." Nantan called over the rush of the water, his voice carrying but not shouting. He guided his horse alongside Clara's close enough that his leg nearly touched hers. The water was already up to the horses' chests, foam swirling around them, pulling at their legs. "Clara, look at me." Not at the water. "Look at me." She dragged her gaze from the churning current and met his eyes. They were steady calm, holding hers with an intensity that cut through the panic rising in her chest. Her fingers were fisted in the wet mane knuckles, white, her breath coming fast and ragged. The mare lunged forward, suddenly hooves slipping on the slick stones, and for one sickening, endless moment, Clara felt the animal going down the current, grabbing at them both with greedy hands. Then Nantan's hand closed around her wrist, his grip so strong it was almost painful. And he urged his horse closer, their legs touching now in the water, his presence solid and immovable. "I have you. Step. That is it. Good. Again. Step." His voice was a lifeline in the chaos. Inch by brutal inch they crossed. The horses struggled, muscles straining, water spraying up around them in cold arcs that soaked Clara's dress and weighed her down. Her arms ached from holding on her thighs, cramped from gripping the saddle, her lungs burned from holding her breath every time a wave splashed over her head. But Nantan did not let go of her wrist, and his eyes never left hers, and finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the horses lunged up the far bank, soaked and trembling, but alive. Clara collapsed against her mare's neck, gasping, shaking her face pressed into the wet hide. The ledgers, wrapped in oiled cloth and tied securely to Nantan's saddle, had survived. "You did well," Nantan said quietly, and there was something in his voice, not quite warmth, but close to it, that made Clara's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. That night, the 5th since leaving town, they took shelter under an overhanging ledge as a dry lightning storm lashed the plateau with elemental fury. Thunder rolled across the sky like artillery fire, shaking the very ground beneath them. Jagged bolts of lightning split the darkness, illuminating the landscape in stark white flashes that left afterimages burned into Clara's vision. Wind tore at her shawl with invisible hands, and grit stung her eyes and got into her mouth, grinding between her teeth. The rain came sideways, when it came at all cold and fierce, and over almost before it began, leaving only the smell of wet stone and ozone. Clara and Nantan wedged themselves behind a boulder barely large enough for two pressed together out of sheer necessity, because there was no room for modesty or careful distance. Instinct made him curl around her to block the worst of the wind, his body a shield between her and the storm's fury. Clara found her cheek pressed against the hollow of his throat, her ear against his chest, where she could hear his heartbeat steady, unhurried, a counterpoint to the chaos around them. His skin was warm despite the rain, and she could feel the tension in his muscles, the careful way he held himself, as though afraid to allow even this small comfort, because it might become something more, something he could not afford. "This is only because of the storm." He muttered more to himself than to her, as though saying it aloud would make it true and safe and temporary. "I know." Clara answered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. But she did not move away when the next roll of thunder shook the earth, and she felt his arms tighten around her just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though his body knew something his mind refused to acknowledge. On the 6th day, they skirted the edge of a low mesa, moving through open ground that made Clara's skin crawl with the sense of being watched. And then, because the universe has a cruel sense of timing, two riders appeared on the ridge behind them, dark shapes silhouetted against the bright sky, raising dust as they came. Horatio's men. There was no doubt. The chase that followed was brutal and exhausting, stripped of any romance or adventure. It was simply hard gallops over broken rock that could snap a horse's leg, Clara clinging to the saddle horn with both hands until her fingers cramped her thighs, aching her lungs, burning with each gasping breath. The horse's hooves struck sparks off the stone, a sound like metal on metal that seemed impossibly loud in the vast silence. Nantan did not panic. He never panicked. Clara realized his mind worked with a cold clarity, even in crisis. He doubled back through a narrow box gully, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, leading them into terrain he knew. And their pursuers did not setting an ambush with the patient precision of a man who had done this before and understood the cost of failure. When the first rider's horse scrambled up a loose slope, scattering pebbles and sending small rocks clattering down, Nantan appeared above him on the rim, like a ghost made solid. His rifle was already leveled, his aim steady. The shot echoed off the canyon walls with a crack like the world breaking. The rider's horse reared screaming iron-shod hooves, flailing at the air, and threw the man hard into a stand of cholla cactus. The man's screams echoed long after the gunshot faded, high and terrible, the sound of someone learning that pain has depths they never imagined. The second rider tried to flank them, circling wide around the gully to come at them from another angle. Clara, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the rifle Nantan had insisted she learn to use, raised it to her shoulder with movements that felt clumsy and slow. She sighted down the barrel, trying to remember everything he had taught her in their brief, hurried lessons. Breathe out. Squeeze the trigger, do not pull. The rifle is a part of your body, an extension of your will. She squeezed. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, hard enough to bruise, and the noise was deafening, leaving her ears ringing. The shot went wide. She was not skilled enough to hit what she aimed at, but it shattered the man's gun hand instead of his chest. He screamed a high animal sound of shock and pain and wheeled his horse away, blood streaming between his fingers as he cradled the ruin of his hand against his chest. His revolver fell to the rocks with a clatter. That night, the sixth night, they made camp in a sheltered spot among juniper trees, where the wind was softer and the ground less hostile. Nantan did not speak much. He cleaned his rifle with methodical care, checked the horses moving with the mechanical precision of a man too tired to think beyond the immediate task. Clara boiled coffee over a small fire, her hands still trembling slightly, and watched him trying to understand the shape of the silence between them. Finally, because the silence was becoming unbearable, she said, "I could have killed him." Nantan looked up from the rifle, his eyes meeting hers across the small fire. "But you did not. I do not know if that is because I am a good shot or a bad one." He studied her for a long moment, firelight playing across his face and casting half of it in shadow. "You are alive. He is not dead. In this country with these stakes, that is enough." He paused, then added more quietly, "You did what was necessary to defend your life. Do not carry guilt for surviving. The world will give you burdens enough without you adding to them." It was not absolution. Nantan did not deal in absolution or comfort or easy words, but it was something. Clara nodded slowly, throat tight, and took the tin cup of coffee he handed her. Their fingers brushed in the exchange just for a moment, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as they might have a few days before. The touch lingered, and in that lingering was an acknowledgement neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud. The next evening, the 7th since leaving town, they made camp in a stand of juniper, where the air smelled of resin and dust and the faint promise of rain that never came. Clara helped Nantan do something she suspected he would never have allowed anyone else to do. She took his eagle feather bonnet, that symbol of his identity and his history, and carefully, reverently removed the most distinctive beadwork and the longer side feathers that made him immediately recognizable. She replaced them with plain leather cord and a single crow feather he carried in a small pouch, transforming the bonnet into something more anonymous, something that might allow him to pass as just another mixed-blood ranch hand at a distance. Her fingers brushed the line of his jaw as she adjusted the new headband, checking the fit, making sure it would not slip. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, rough with several days' growth of beard. He went very still, every muscle in his body tense. His eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, as though the sunset required his complete attention. His throat worked as he swallowed, and for a moment she thought he would pull away, retreat back into the careful distance that had defined them since the beginning. But he did not. He stayed motionless beneath her hands, allowing the intimacy of the moment. And when she finally stepped back, satisfied with her work, he met her eyes and said quietly, "You do not owe me this. You saved my life 4 times in 7 days." Clara replied, her voice equally soft. "Let me help save yours." "You are stubborn," he said. And there was the faintest hint of something that might have been a smile at the corner of his mouth, something she had not seen before, and found she wanted to see again. "So are you," she countered. "Yes," he agreed. He held her gaze for another moment, and something passed between them unspoken, but understood a recognition that they were no longer strangers bound together by necessity, but something else. Partners, perhaps, or the beginning of something neither of them had words for, yet something that made Clara's heart beat faster and her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Meanwhile, back in Coyote Springs, the world was shifting in small but critical ways. Ruth Miller had taken in 2 immigrant girls who had escaped from one of Horatio's holding houses. Valentina, a Mexican girl of 19 with fierce dark eyes and a vocabulary of English curses she had learned from miners, and Guinevere, a Welsh girl barely 16 who spoke almost no English and flinched at sudden movements. Ruth fed them, kept them hidden in the schoolhouse cellar, behind a false wall she had built herself, and began quietly gathering their testimony, writing down every detail they could remember in her careful teacher's script. Dr. Samuel Price, a worn man in his 50s, with gray threading through his beard and lines of fatigue carved deep around his eyes, was finally keeping notes. For years he had stitched wounds and delivered babies and set broken bones, and kept his mouth shut about the uglier things he saw. But conscience long dormant had awakened. Now he wrote everything down in a journal hidden in his medical bag. Names, injuries, whispered confessions, from women who passed through Finch's bride office and ended up in his surgery with broken ribs, concussions worse. His handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of a man who knew these notes might one day be the evidence that broke the case wide open or got him killed. And Owen, a poor farmer near Whirlwind Pass, who owed Horatio money he could never repay, wrestled with his conscience in the long hours after his children were asleep. He had a wife, Margaret, who was the best thing in his hard life, and 2 small children who still looked at him as though he were a hero instead of a man drowning in debt and cowardice. He knew what Horatio did, everyone knew, in the way that everyone knows terrible things they choose not to see. But speaking against a man like Finch meant debts called in. Immediately land seized, maybe worse. Maybe fire in the night. Maybe finding your livestock dead in the morning, poisoned. Maybe your children warned on their way home from school. "What kind of man am I if I stay silent?" he asked Margaret one night as they lay in the darkness of their small bedroom, her body warm beside his, the sound of their children breathing in the next room. His voice was raw, scraped clean of everything but the question. She said nothing for a long time. Then she took his hand and held it tight, her grip surprisingly strong. "You are the kind of man who is afraid," she said finally. "But maybe you can also be the kind of man who is afraid and acts anyway. That is not weakness, Owen. That is the hardest kind of courage there is." In the morning, Owen rode out to find Ruth Miller and ask what he could do to help. It was a small choice, but it would prove to be the hinge on which everything turned. The pieces were slowly, painfully coming together, fragile, uncertain, but real. On the 8th day, they rendezvoused at an abandoned silver mine in the low hills west of town, a place Owen knew from his youth and others avoided out of superstition or simple good sense. The land around it was scarred with tailings that glittered dully in the sun, rusted machinery half buried in the earth like the bones of some massive creature. The ghosts of fortunes promised and lost hovering over everything like a curse. The main shaft gaped in the hillside like a wound that had never healed, its timbers gray and splintered, exhaling cool air that smelled of damp rock and bat guano and the slow decay of wood. Owen arrived first, bringing lanterns, blankets, and his rifle. He stood near the entrance, watching the trail with nervous eyes that never stopped moving, jumping at every sound. Ruth arrived after dark on the 2nd day, bringing Valentina and Guinevere with her. All 3 women were wrapped in shawls despite the heat, moving quickly and quietly, keeping to the shadows. Dr. Samuel came last, riding slowly on an old mare, his medical bag slung over his shoulder, his face pale and drawn. He looked every one of his 53 years, and then some guilt and exhaustion wearing grooves into his features like water-carving stone. Inside the mine, by the light of lanterns that threw long dancing shadows on the rough stone walls, Clara spread the salvaged ledger pages on a crate. The group gathered around Nanton, standing slightly apart, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Ruth with her hands folded tightly in front of her, as though in prayer. Owen shifting his weight from foot to foot. The 2 girls huddled together, their eyes wide and wary. The pages were damning. Names marched down each sheet in Horatio's precise, businesslike hand. Remedios, Guinevere, Valentina, Mary, Sarah. Others Clara did not recognize. Beside each name, an age, a physical description, hair color, eye color, height, distinguishing marks, and a price. Some entries had destinations listed: mining camps, ranches, towns across the territory and into Mexico. Some had notations about difficult or compliant behavior, about value depreciated due to injury or resistance. Most of the entries were brutally routine, clinical in their indifference, the language of commerce applied to human flesh. Then Nanton, standing beside Clara and looking over her shoulder, went utterly still. His body tensed, as though struck, every muscle locking his breath, stopping mid-draw. Clara followed his gaze and saw the entry that had frozen him. Rayan, age 15, Apache, black hair, brown eyes, 5'3", scar on left hand from childhood burn, destination Border Ranch, Sonora. Initial payment $40. Note, subject resisted processing. Difficult, reduced value. And then, in a different hand, rougher, less educated, a notation scrawled in the margin. Shipment disrupted by bandits near Nogales. Wagon attacked. 1 girl escaped during fight. Others sold off cheap to local buyers, no paperwork. Loss acceptable. Proof, not rumor, not fading hope or desperate imagination. Cold, ugly ink tying Horatio Finch directly to the night Nantan's sister vanished, and worse, documenting that she had been sold like livestock, that her resistance had lowered her price, that she had been valued at $40 and deemed an acceptable loss when the deal went bad. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Nantan's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. Clara could see his hands trembling just slightly, but unmistakably, before he clenched them into fists so tight his knuckles went white. His jaw was locked and the muscles jumping beneath the skin, and when she glanced at his face, she saw something that frightened her. Not anger exactly, though anger was there, but something deeper and more dangerous, a grief so profound it threatened to tear him apart from the inside. He turned away from the crate, walking a few steps deeper into the mine. where the lamplight did not reach one hand, pressed to his forehead, as though trying to hold himself together through sheer force of will. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing harsh and uneven. And Clara understood instinctively that he was on the edge of breaking that years of control and discipline were threatening to shatter under the weight of this single, terrible revelation. Dr. Samuel, standing near one of the lanterns, cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was low and heavy with guilt, each word dragged up from some deep well of shame. 2 years ago, he began, his hands twisting together. Late autumn, I treated a wounded rider who came through town. Gunshot in the thigh, deep infection setting in. He was drunk and in terrible pain, and he talked the way frightened men talk when they think they might die and want someone to remember they existed. He bragged about a job he had done hauling wildcat girls south for a merchant. Samuel paused, swallowing hard, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. He said the girls were Apache taken from a relocation, and they were worth less because they fought back. He laughed about it, said one of them had bitten a man's finger half off. Said Mexican bandits hit their wagon near the border, and one girl got away during the shooting, but the rest were sold off quick to anyone with coin, no questions asked. The doctor's hands were shaking now. The horse he rode bore Horatio Finch's freight brand, clear as day, burned into the left hindquarter. I saw it in my stable when I went out to water the animal. I knew what it meant, but His voice broke. I did nothing. I told myself it was not my business, that I could not be certain, that speaking up would only make trouble. When you told me your sister's name, Nantan, and her age, it all came back. I checked my old notes and the timing matched. I should have spoken 2 years ago. I am sorry. That does not change anything, but I am sorry. The apology hung in the air, like smoke, inadequate and true, all at once. No one spoke. Guinevere was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Valentina had her arm around the younger girl, her own face hard and angry. Owen looked sick, his weathered face gone pale. Ruth stood with her hands clenched so tight, her nails dug crescents into her palms. Nantan stood with his back to them all, his head bowed, and Clara could see the tremor running through him. Rage and grief, and something else, something that might have been hope, trying desperately to survive in scorched earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as gravel scraped raw. "We take this back," he said, not turning around. "We drag his name into the sunlight. We make him answer for every girl in that book, every name, every price, every lie." He drew a shaking breath, and Clara heard the sound of a man trying not to break. "And then I ride south for my sister. If she escaped, if she is alive, I will find her. I swear it." The mission had shifted. It was no longer just about Clara's escape or even the rescue of nameless girls in a ledger. It was personal now, burning with the heat of righteous fury. And it bound them all together in a way that went deeper than shared danger. This was about justice, not the abstract kind written in law books, but the real, bloody, necessary kind that sometimes had to be taken because it would never be given. Clara looked at the ledger, then at Nantan's rigid back, and felt her own resolve harden into something like steel. "We will find her," she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "I give you my word, Nantan. We will not stop until we do." He turned then slowly and looked at her. His eyes were bright, not with tears because he did not allow himself tears, but with something that glittered and hurt to see. Hope. Fragile, painful hope. "Your word?" he asked, and his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "My word," she repeated. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It was not trust. Trust took longer to build, but it was belief, and in that moment, it was enough. Ruth stepped forward, her voice brisk and practical. cutting through the thick emotion like a knife through cloth. Then we need to move quickly. Finch knows something is wrong by now. He will be gathering men, offering bounties, calling in favors. We have maybe 2 days before he comes for us with everything he has. Owen nodded, gripping his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. My farm is too exposed. He knows where it is, knows my family. But this mine, if we can fortify the entrance, maybe we can hold out long enough to— No, Nantan said, shaking his head. We do not hide. Hiding solves nothing. We go back to town. We make him answer in front of his own people where they cannot pretend not to see. It was a dangerous plan, possibly suicidal. Walking back into Coyote Springs, where Horatio had money and men, and the law in his pocket, was madness. But it was also the only way to break the lie he had built around himself, the lie that he was a respectable businessman, that the girls came willingly, that anyone who said otherwise was a troublemaker or savage or a liar. They would march back into Coyote Springs and shatter that lie for all to see, or they would die trying. Dawn on the 9th day came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind a veil of high clouds that turned the world colorless and flat. Clara woke to the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Too many hoofbeats coming fast, the sound like thunder rolling toward them. Bitter Sam had found them, and he had not come alone. Gunfire shattered the stillness before anyone could react. Bullets ricocheted off stone, throwing chips of rock into the air with sharp cracks that echoed and re-echoed until it sounded like an army firing. Owen dove for cover behind a fallen timber near the mouth of the shaft, his old rifle coming up, and began returning fire in steady, deliberate shots. Get inside, he shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. All of you now. Nantan pushed Clara, Valentina, and Guinevere toward the mine entrance, one hand on Clara's back, urging her forward. Ruth stumbled behind them, one hand pressed to her side, where a bullet had grazed her ribs, not deep, but bleeding blood seeping between her fingers and staining her dress dark. Her face was pale, but determined teeth gritted against the pain. They moved deeper into the mine, Nantan holding the lantern, high shadows leaping and stretching grotesquely around them like living things. The tunnel narrowed as they went, the ceiling dropping lower, forcing them to duck their heads. The timbers overhead were ancient and rotting, sagging under the weight of the earth above, and Clara could hear them creaking ominously, groaning like something in pain. Behind them, the gunfire continued, Owen's rifle cracking in steady rhythm, the attackers' guns answering in a ragged chorus. Then, cutting through the noise, came a different sound and the sharp, unmistakable crack of a bullet striking wood. One of the support beams deep in the shaft shuddered and then split lengthwise with a sound like breaking bone. The mine groaned, a low, terrible sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the very stones around them. Clara had time to draw breath for a scream before part of the ceiling collapsed. Rocks crashed down in a deafening avalanche, dust exploding into the air in a choking cloud that filled the tunnel and blotted out the lamplight. Clara threw her arms over her head, curling into herself, feeling debris rain down on her shoulders and back. She could not breathe, could not see, could not hear anything but the roar of falling stone and her own heart hammering in her ears. When the thunder finally stopped and the dust began to settle, she realized with horror that the narrowest part of the tunnel was sealed a wall of rubble separating them from Ruth and Guinevere, who had been just a few steps behind. Ruth? Clara screamed, scrambling toward the rockfall, her hands tearing at the stones. Guinevere, can you hear me? A muffled voice came from the other side, faint and distorted. We are alive, but we cannot get through. Nantan assessed the situation with a glance that took in everything: the blocked tunnel, the sagging beam overhead that was the only thing keeping the rest of the ceiling from coming down, the dust still thick in the air. He made a decision in that split second, a decision that went against every survival instinct he had. He handed the lantern to Valentina, then wedged his body under the massive, sagging beam, taking its weight on his shoulders. The timber was huge, heavy as sin, and Clara could see every muscle in his body straining, trembling with the effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His breath came in harsh, controlled gasps. "Dig," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "Now, fast." Clara and Valentina tore at the rubble with their bare hands, nails breaking palms scraped raw, and bleeding every breath thick with dust that clogged their throats, made them cough. Every stone they dragged free sent smaller pebbles skittering down around Nantan's head, and Clara lived in terror that one of them would strike him, make him flinch, make his strength falter for just a moment. If he let go, the rest of the ceiling would come down and bury them all. Outside the mine, Owen fought with the desperation of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. "Come on, you damn vultures!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Come on!" He fired and reloaded his hands, moving with frantic speed. One of Sam's men went down screaming, clutching his belly where Owen's bullet had torn through. Another's horse bolted in panic, throwing its rider hard into a patch of prickly pear. The man's shrieks echoed across the hillside. Inside, Clara's world had narrowed to her bleeding hands, the pile of rocks, and Nantan's trembling body holding up the world. Finally, after an eternity that probably lasted only minutes, there was a gap. Ruth squeezed through first her dress-torn face, streaked with blood and dust and tears, then turned back to help pull Guinevere after her. The Welsh girl was sobbing, hyperventilating, clinging to Ruth like a drowning person clings to driftwood. "Now!" Clara shouted. "Nantan now!" He released the beam and staggered back his legs, nearly giving out beneath him. The moment he moved, another section of roof dropped with a deafening crash, sealing the passage, completely filling the tunnel behind them with a wall of stone and broken timber that would never be moved without picks and dynamite and days of labor. They stumbled forward through the choking dust, coughing half-blind toward the back ventilation tunnel Owen had told them about, a narrow shaft dug decades ago to improve air circulation, now their only escape. They crawled through it on hands and knees, the passage so tight Clara's shoulders scraped the sides, until finally they emerged onto the hillside 100 yards from the main entrance, gasping and filthy and alive. Bitter Sam stood on the ridge above the main entrance, reloading his revolvers, his face purple with rage. When he saw them emerge from the hillside like ghosts rising from the grave, he screamed wordlessly and fired, but the range was too great. The bullets fell short, kicking up dust. They found their horses where Owen had hidden them in a small box canyon mounted despite their exhaustion and injuries, and rode hard for 2 hours before they dared to stop. Owen was grazed along the ribs, his shirt soaked with blood. Ruth's side was still seeping despite the makeshift bandage Valentina had tied. Nantan could barely move his arms, his shoulders and back screaming from the weight he had borne. Clara's hands were a mess of torn flesh and embedded grit. But they were alive. They had the ledgers, and running was no longer an option. It was time to go back and end this one way or another. The return to Coyote Springs happened on the 10th day in the early afternoon, when the sun was at its height and the shadows were short and offered no hiding places. Word of their approach ran ahead of them like wildfire through dry grass, and by the time they rode slowly down Main Street, Nantan and Clara in the lead, followed by Ruth, Dr. Samuel Owen, and the two girls, a vigilante mob was already gathering. It was not an organized thing. It was a living creature made of anger and righteousness, and fear fed by rumors and lies, and the primal human need to find someone to blame, someone to hurt. Miners with pick handles, townsmen with rope, Horatio's hired guns with revolvers, They seethed in the street like a boiling pot ready to overflow. Phase 1. The mob. They did not wait for explanations or evidence or even the pretense of law. The moment Nantan's horse came to a stop in front of the saloon, men surged forward like a wave breaking. They hauled him from the saddle before he could dismount, before Clara could even draw breath to scream a warning. Fists and boots flew meaty thuds of impact, and Nantan went down under the press of bodies, trying to protect his head with his arms. Someone Clara never saw, who already had a noose, prepared the rope coiled and ready, as though they had been waiting for this, hoping for it. They slipped it over Nantan's neck and threw the other end over a livery rafter, and the crowd roared approval, a sound more animal than human. Hang the savage. Teach him what happens when he touches white women. Justice, give us justice. They hauled on the rope. Clara watched in paralyzed horror as Nantan was dragged to his feet, then lifted his boots, leaving the ground toes scrabbling in the dust for purchase that was not there. His hands flew to the noose fingers, digging under the hemp, trying desperately to relieve the pressure. But the rope was already biting deep into his throat, cutting off air, cutting off blood. His face began to darken, going from brown to red to a terrible purple. His eyes bulged. His mouth opened in a soundless gasp, unable to draw breath, and Clara could see his tongue beginning to protrude. She fought forward through the crowd, clawing at the men holding her back, screaming words she would not remember later. A hand closed on her arm. Bitter Sam, his broken nose twisted into something barely human, his breath foul in her face. He shoved the barrel of his revolver against her ribs, cold and hard and final. Say, he forced you. Sam hissed his voice, a serpent's whisper. Say it loud in front of everyone, and maybe I let you live long enough to go back to Finch. Clara looked at him. Then she looked at Nantan, dying slowly, at the end of a rope, his struggles weakening his face the color of an old bruise. She met Sam's eyes and spat directly in his face, the saliva mixed with blood from her split lip. Sam's face twisted. He backhanded her across the face, and Clara's vision exploded in stars and pain blood, filling her mouth from a cut on the inside of her cheek. But she did not fall, and she did not take back her defiance. The mob kept pulling. Nantan's hands fell from the rope strength, finally failing. His eyes began to roll back, showing white. Phase 2. The stampede. Then from the far end of town came a sound like the world ending, a deep, drumming thunder that shook the ground, that made loose boards rattle and windows vibrate in their frames. Owen had done it. The plan they had made at the mine, the desperate, half-mad plan, was happening. For 2 days, Owen had been quietly moving his small herd of cattle into position, using every trick he knew to keep them agitated and on edge, denying them water, using smoke to make them nervous, even firing guns near them in the night, to rob them of sleep and reason. He had turned his own livestock into weapons. And now he drove them straight down Main Street with shouts and gunfire, a living avalanche of horns and hooves in blind panic. The cattle hit the bottleneck between buildings like a battering ram made of flesh. Dust exploded into the air, thick enough to blind turning day into twilight. Men scattered like leaves before a storm, diving for doorways, scrambling under wagons, throwing themselves flat in the dirt. The beam the hanging rope was tied to took the impact of a massive longhorn steer, slamming full force into the post. Wood splintered with a crack like a rifle shot. The beam gave way. The noose jerked violently, then went slack as the whole structure collapsed. Nantan dropped to the ground, landing hard on his knees, the rope still around his neck, but no longer pulling him toward death. He clawed at the noose with hands that barely responded, his vision-swimming lungs screaming for air that would not come. Clara freed for a moment as Sam ducked to avoid a charging steer dove through the chaos. She yanked the small knife from her boot, the one Nantan had given her what felt like a lifetime ago, and sawed frantically at the rope biting into his neck. Her hands were shaking, her vision blurred with tears and dust. But she cut and cut the hemp fibers, resisting, then fraying, then parting with a snap. The rope fell away. Nantan collapsed forward, hands at his throat, gasping like a drowning man, breaking the surface, each breath a harsh, tearing rasp that sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. Clara grabbed him and pulled, hauling him toward the shelter of an overturned wagon, as cattle thundered past, their hooves striking the ground inches from where they had been, close enough that Clara felt the wind of their passage and smelled the animal heat of them. Phase 3. The final confrontation. But Horatio Finch had not survived this long by being careless or unprepared. From the balcony of the saloon, he and 2 hired riflemen began firing methodically into the chaos below. They were not shooting randomly, they aimed with cold precision at specific targets. At Nantan, at Clara, at Ruth, at anyone who threatened the careful structure of lies Horatio had built. Bullets chewed the dirt around the wagon, punched through its wooden sides, sent splinters flying. One of the riflemen was very good, a professional, not just a drunken thug, and his shots came closer with each pull of the trigger. Bitter Sam, seeing his last chance slipping away like water through his fingers, ducked into the livery loft. He climbed quickly, breathing hard, trying for a clear shot at Nantan, his face a mask of hatred and greed. The bounty was so close he could taste it. Nantan, still barely able to breathe, his voice gone to a raw whisper, staggered into the stable below. His vision was still graying at the edges, his head pounding, but his knife was in his hand, and his will was unbroken. He heard Sam above him, heard the creak of boards, and moved toward the ladder despite his body's protests. They met in the loft, and there was no grace to what followed, no elegance. It was brutal and ugly, and desperate, 2 men fighting for their lives among hay bales and terrified horses every breath. Nantan drew a study in agony. Sam slashed with his skinning knife, the blade catching Nantan across the ribs, drawing a line of fire. Nantan responded by driving his thumb into the half-healed bullet wound in Sam's thigh, the wound from the mine pressing deep. Sam's scream was high and inhuman, his leg buckling beneath him. Nantan used the last reserves of his strength to throw Sam backward into an empty stall. A panicked horse, eyes rolling white with terror, lashed out with both hind hooves in pure instinct. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef, meaty, final, terrible. Sam's chest caved in. He hit the boards and slid down, leaving a dark smear blood bubbling from his lips. His eyes went distant, unfocused, and then still. Nantan leaned against the stall door chest, heaving each breath a fresh agony vision swimming. He could not have fought another man if his life had depended on it. He had nothing left. Outside, Horatio realized with the cold clarity of a man watching his empire crumble that he was out of time and options. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest, the master ledger fragment he had kept separate, the one containing the names of his wealthiest and most powerful clients' men, who would pay fortunes to keep their secrets buried, and bolted from the balcony. He ran for the telegraph office, his last desperate gamble. If he could send warnings call in favors threaten exposure of his clients, unless they protected him, he might still salvage something from this disaster. But Ruth Miller and Dr. Samuel were waiting at the telegraph office door. They had anticipated him. Ruth stepped into his path, and Horatio, wild-eyed and beyond reason, raised his revolver and fired without hesitation. The bullet caught Samuel in the shoulder, high on the left side, shattering his collarbone and spinning him back against the doorframe. Blood sprayed across the whitewashed wood in a fan pattern, bright and arterial. Samuel cried out a sound more of surprise than pain and went to his knees, but he did not fall unconscious. He did not give up. With his one good arm driven by years of guilt and this one chance at redemption, He lunged forward and caught Horatio's legs, bringing him down hard onto the boardwalk. Ruth dove on top of Horatio, wrenching the satchel from his grip, and thrust it at Clara, who had just reached the doorway, her dress torn and filthy blood on her face. "Send it." Samuel gasped, his voice raw with pain and determination. "Every name, every crime, send it all before he." Samuel dragged himself to the telegraph key, leaving a trail of blood, his vision tunneling, his one good hand shaking violently. He could not send a full message, the pain was too great, his strength fading, but he could send the essentials. His fingers found the key and began to tap in short, urgent bursts. "So stop slavery, stop Finch, stop Coyote Springs, stop Marshall, stop." The message was fragmentary, desperate, barely coherent, but it was enough. It would reach the territorial marshal's office. It would raise alarms. It would start the machinery of justice, slow and grinding, but unstoppable once set in motion. Horatio wrenched free from Ruth's grip and lunged for the door, driven by panic and fury in equal measure. He burst onto the porch just as the last of the cattle were scattering foam at their mouths, eyes wild. One massive steer mind, broken by fear and exhaustion, slammed full force into the telegraph post. The post snapped. The overhang, weakened by years of weather and neglect, came down in a catastrophic collapse of timber and tin roofing and rusted nails. Horatio had time for one short, sharp cry. Then the beam caught him across the chest and head, driving him backward. His skull struck the edge of the boardwalk with a crack Clara heard from inside the office. The beam pinned him, crushing his chest, and blood poured from his mouth and nose and ears. He stared up at the sky, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, and Clara watched the light go out of them, like a candle snuffed by the wind. The street fell silent, except for the sound of hooves receding in the distance, and the harsh breathing of people who had survived. The mob, forced to confront what they had done, nearly murdered a man without trial. Without evidence, driven by lies and fear, stood frozen, staring at their own hands, as though seeing blood there for the first time. It was over. In the hours and days that followed, Coyote Springs began the slow, painful process of reckoning with itself. Sheriff Harlan, forced at last to act like the lawman he had always claimed to be, locked the surviving hired gunmen in cells and posted armed deputies outside to keep order. He took statements from Ruth, from Dr. Samuel, whose shoulder was in a sling and whose face was gray with pain and blood loss, but who refused laudanum until he had given his full testimony, from Owen, from the 2 rescued girls, from Clara herself. Townspeople came forward slowly, reluctantly, with stories they had kept silent for years. A miner's wife spoke of a sister who had answered an advertisement and never been heard from again. A rancher admitted he had once bought a bride through Finch and been too ashamed to speak when the girl had tried to run away. A saloon girl testified that Horatio had threatened to have her killed if she ever spoke about what happened in the rooms above the bar. The ledgers were laid out in the saloon, now converted into a temporary courthouse, and people crowded in to read the names. Some recognized daughters, sisters, cousins. Some saw their own complicity written in ink. The silence in that room was thick and choking. Clara helped organize everything, her torn hands wrapped in bandages, her face bruised, but her spine straight. She matched names to belongings, wrote letters to families back east, coordinated with Ruth to house the women who were stranded and had nowhere to go. Nantan sat outside Dr. Samuel's office for 3 days, unable to speak above a whisper because of the damage to his throat. His neck was wrapped in bandages soaked with salve, the rope burn a vicious red line that would scar. He breathed with difficulty, each inhalation a conscious effort, but he refused to leave. He watched the town, and the town watched him, and slowly, very slowly, a few people began to nod to him as they passed. Not friendliness exactly, but acknowledgement. Perhaps the beginning of something like respect. Clara sat beside him often, their shoulders touching, saying little because words were not necessary. They had survived, and that created a bond that went deeper than language. Owen returned to his farm on the fourth day, riding slowly, his ribs bandaged beneath his shirt. Margaret met him at the door, and when he told her what he had done, she wept and held him and told him she was proud. His children looked at him differently after that, with a kind of awed respect that made Owen both uncomfortable and fiercely glad. Ruth threw herself into practical work, converting Horatio's warehouse into a proper boarding house, organizing donations of food and clothing, teaching the women who stayed how to read and write and keep accounts so they would never be helpless again. She was tireless, driven by the fury of someone who had stayed silent too long and would never make that mistake again. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The territorial marshal sent word that he was coming, that formal proceedings would be held, that this case would not be swept under the rug, as so many others had been. Resolution. When Territorial Marshal Thaddeus Cole finally arrived on the 16th day, trailing dust from 3 days of hard riding, he brought 2 deputies and a thick packet of telegraphs from across the territory and beyond. Similar complaints. Missing women. Contracts that looked disturbingly like Horatio's. The case was bigger than Coyote Springs, much bigger, and it would take years to fully unravel. But it had started here, and here it would be answered. A formal hearing was held in the saloon, hastily cleaned and rearranged, every chair filled, and people standing along the walls. Clara presented her testimony with quiet precision, and the advertisement, the journey, the discovery of the ledger, the attack on the wagon, everything that followed. She spoke for nearly an hour, her voice never wavering, and when she finished, the room was silent. Dr. Samuel Arm, still in a sling, added his confession and his medical notes, his voice thick with shame, but unflinching. "I knew," he said simply. "I knew, and I did nothing. That makes me complicit. I will live with that for the rest of my life." Owen testified about the business opportunities Horatio had offered him, the pressure to stay silent, the slow corrosion of conscience. "I thought protecting my family meant keeping my head down," he said, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. Silence protects monsters, not children." Ruth presented the testimony of Valentina and Guinevere, translating for the Welsh girl whose English was still limited, documenting their captivity and escape with the meticulous detail of a woman who understood that evidence, not emotion, would win the day. Marshal Cole listened to it all with the weary patience of a man who had seen too much evil and knew he would see more before he died. When the testimony concluded, he declared that Horatio Finch's property would be seized and liquidated, the proceeds used to compensate victims and fund their passage to new lives or back home as they chose. Then he produced a file from his satchel. Thin, dog-eared, the paper yellowed with age. "One more matter," he said, looking directly at Nanton. "You have been inquiring after a girl named Rayen for 3 years, sending letters to every fort and marshal's office from here to Mexico. Your description was in the telegraph message Dr. Samuel sent. I had my clerk review old reports." The room went quiet. Clara felt her heart begin to pound. 18 months ago," Cole continued, "a cavalry patrol near Nogales intercepted bandits attacking a freight wagon. The bandits scattered. In the aftermath, the patrol found evidence of human trafficking chains, women's clothing, a ledger. One Apache girl escaped during the fighting and was found 2 days later by a vaquero couple heading to a ranch near Agua Prieta. She gave her brother's name as Nanton and asked that word be sent to Fort Bowie." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "The request was logged, then forgotten. Bureaucratic failure. The vaquero's name is listed here as Esteban Morales. The ranch is called Las Golondrinas, the Swallows. It is still operating far as we know." He slid the paper across the table to Nanton. Rayen was alive, or had been 18 months ago. It was not a guarantee so much could happen in 18 months, But it was more than Nantan had had in 3 years. It was hope solid and real, written in bureaucratic language and official ink. Nantan took the paper with hands that shook. He stared at it for a long moment, his eyes bright, his throat working as he tried to swallow past the lump of emotion threatening to choke him worse than any rope. He could not speak, his voice was still barely a whisper, his throat too damaged, but he nodded once sharply to the marshal and pressed the paper against his chest, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Clara felt tears burn her eyes, hot and unexpected, and did not try to stop them. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple, the town gathered in the yard behind the saloon. It was not a celebration. There had been too much pain, too much loss. But it was a gathering, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, that they had faced something terrible and survived. Valentina sat with Guinevere and Ruth, talking quietly, making plans. Dr. Samuel sat on a bench, pale and exhausted, accepting quiet thanks from women he had once failed, and would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends to. Owen stood with Margaret and their children, his arm around his wife, his face peaceful in a way it had not been in years. Clara found Nantan at the edge of the gathering, leaning against a post, his silhouette sharp against the dying light. She walked up beside him without speaking, and they stood together in companionable silence for a long moment. "You will go south?" she said finally. Not a question. "Yes." His voice was still a whisper, rough and damaged, but intelligible. "I have to find her. I have to know." "I know." Clara took a breath, steadying herself against what she needed to say. "The marshal helped me file a homestead claim. The riverside land where we camped it is not mine yet, not officially, but the claim is registered. It will take time, but it is a start." She turned to look at him. "I am going to build something there. A place where people who have nowhere else can go. Women like Valentina and Guinevere. Ranch hands who are tired of being cheated. Maybe some of your people who want to leave the reservation but have no place to go." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I will need help. Someone who knows the land, who knows where the water flows and where it floods, who can teach others how to survive here. Someone who—" Her voice caught slightly. "Someone I trust." Nantan studied her face in the fading light, his dark eyes searching hers. The old condition help when paid, then right away stirred in his chest. But it felt thin now, worn through by everything that had happened, by the bond that had been forged between them, in fire and blood and shared survival. Clara reached out and took his hand, not to claim him, not to perform for anyone, but simply because she wanted to, because it felt right. She turned his hand over and pressed the homestead claim paper into his palm, folding his fingers around it so their hands were joined around the document. "You asked me to pretend to be your woman," she said quietly. "I will not pretend anymore. When you come back from Mexico, come back as my partner, as my family, if you will have me. I do not know what the law will call it. The law does not seem to care much for what we want anyway. But I know what I want. I want you to stay. Not because you owe me, not because I saved you or you saved me, but because this—" She gestured between them, unable to find adequate words. "This is real, and rare, and worth fighting for." Nantan looked at their joined hands, at the paper between them, at her face. When he finally spoke, his damaged voice was soft but certain. "Apache marriage is not like white marriage. It is simpler. A man and a woman choose each other. They build a home together. They protect each other. That is all. No one's permission needed." He lifted their joined hands and pressed her knuckles against his forehead, a gesture she had seen before, but understood more deeply now. Not possession, not dominance. Partnership, respect, equality. When I return, he whispered, I will help you build this place. I will teach what I know. I will. He stopped struggling with words that did not come easily. I will stay. If you still want me, then. I will want you then, Clara said, and knew it was true. Around them, the lanterns swayed in the evening breeze. The fiddle played softly a slow tune full of longing and hope. Ruth glanced over at them and smiled, then looked away, giving them privacy. Owen raised his tin cup in a silent toast. 2 days later, Nantan left at dawn, riding south toward Mexico, with the marshal's report folded carefully in his shirt pocket, a pack of supplies Clara had insisted he take, and a promise between them that was stronger than any legal document could ever be. He was gone for 3 months. During that time, Clara began the work of building the homestead. She was not alone. Ruth helped, bringing her fierce organizational skills and her refusal to accept defeat. Owen came whenever he could spare time from his own farm, bringing lumber and tools, and his children who played in the creek while the adults worked. Dr. Samuel, his arm healing slowly, stopped by regularly to check on everyone and to teach basic medical care to the women who stayed. Valentina proved to have a gift for managing animals, coaxing even the most stubborn horse or cow with patience Clara envied. Guinevere, shy but determined, learned English with startling speed and began helping Ruth teach the younger children. They cleared brush and dug irrigation ditches. They built a bunkhouse and a small barn, the structures rough but sturdy. The work was back-breaking endless, and Clara fell into her bedroll each night, too exhausted to dream. But she thought of Nantan every day. She wondered if he had found Ryan. She wondered if he would come back, or if the pull of his people and his past would keep him in Mexico. She told herself she would understand either way, that she would not resent whatever choice he made. But the hope sat in her chest like a coal that refused to go cold, warming her through the hardest days. And then, on a bright afternoon in late October, when the cottonwoods along the river had turned gold and the air smelled of dust and distant rain that never quite arrived, a rider appeared on the trail from the south. Clara was mending a fence hammer in hand when she saw him. Her breath caught. She dropped the hammer and stood shading her eyes against the sun, heart beginning to race. He was not alone. A young woman rode beside him, on a paint mare, slender and dark-haired, her posture wary, but not broken, her face marked by hardship, but not destroyed by it. Even from a distance, Clara could see the scar on her left hand, pale against brown skin, shaped like a crescent moon. Ryan. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, sudden and hot. She did not run to meet them. Dignity and uncertainty held her back, but she stood at the fence line and weighted her hands, gripping the rail to keep them from shaking. Nantan dismounted first and helped his sister down. Ryan looked thin, worn, her dress patched, and faded, her feet in moccasins she had clearly made herself. But her eyes were bright and fierce, and when she looked at her brother, there was such love in her face that Clara had to look away, the intimacy of it too much to witness. Nantan spoke to Ryan quietly in Apache, gesturing toward Clara and the half-built homestead. Ryan nodded, glanced at Clara with an assessing look that was neither hostile nor friendly, but simply cautious, then walked toward the bunkhouse where Valentina was hanging laundry. Valentina, who spoke enough Spanish to communicate, greeted her with a smile. Nantan turned and walked toward Clara, stopping a few feet away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give her space if she needed it. He looked older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper but also lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I found her," he said unnecessarily, his voice still rough but stronger than when he had left. The vaquero and his wife treated her well. They gave her work, respected her choices. When I told her about this place, she said— He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. She said she is tired of running. She wants to stay if you will have her. Of course, Clara said immediately. There is room. There is always room. He nodded and then looked past her at the land and the river, the fields they had cleared, the buildings, rising from raw earth, and the people working together. You have built something good here. We have built something, Clara corrected gently. This is yours too. I told you that before you left. He turned back to her, and the look in his eyes was complicated gratitude and affection, and something deeper, something that made Clara's breath catch. I want it, he said simply. I want this place. I want to help it grow. I want. He stopped and then took a step closer, his hand reaching out to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her bruised cheek. I want you. Is that still true? Do you still want me? Clara covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm against her cheek. Yes, she said, her voice steady and certain. I want you. I want this. I want all of it. There were no grand declarations after that, no dramatic embraces for an audience that was not watching. Just two people standing together in the golden afternoon light, choosing each other. Not because the law said they could, but because survival and trust and something deeper, something that might have been love. Though neither of them had dared to name it, yet had forged a bond stronger than any legal document, any ceremony, any words. That night, as the sun set and the air turned cool, Nantan stood with Clara by the river. Ryan was inside the bunkhouse, talking quietly with Valentina and Guinevere, in a mixture of Spanish and halting English, and gestures, the sound of women's voices drifting through the open door like music. Ruth was reading to the younger children from a book about faraway places. Owen had stayed for dinner, and he sat with Dr. Samuel by the fire, their quiet conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. Nantan took Clara's hand, not to perform, not to claim, but simply to hold, and they stood together, watching the water flow south toward Mexico and beyond, carrying with it the debris of the past and leaving the land clean for new growth. His one condition, help when paid, then right away, was gone, burned away, by everything they had endured together. It had been replaced by something far more dangerous and far more honest, a commitment forged not in romance or convenience, but in the brutal crucible of survival, and the slow, steady recognition of another soul, as fierce and stubborn and resilient as one's own. They had fought for justice, and justice had been served imperfect but real. They had found family in the most unlikely places, and they had chosen freely and without pretense to build a life together on land that was as hard and unforgiving and beautiful as the bond between them. In the months and years that followed, the homestead would grow. More people would come, Apaches seeking freedom from the reservation, immigrants fleeing poverty, women escaping bad situations, families looking for a fresh start. It would not be easy. There would be droughts and floods, conflicts and compromises, the endless hard work of turning raw land into something that could sustain life. But it would be theirs. Built by their hands, governed by their choices, defended by their shared determination that this place would be different, a place where people were valued for their character and their contributions, not the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Clara Beatrice Vogt, who had crossed an ocean and a continent alone, would never be alone again. And Nantan, who had lost his sister and his people and his faith in white promises, would find them all again in unexpected forms, built not on paper contracts, but on trust earned in blood and fire, and the slow, patient work of creating something worthy of the sacrifices made to protect it. They stood by the river as darkness fell, and the stars came out one by one, their hands joined their shoulders, touching, watching the future take shape in the land before them.